Alrighty, kia ora everyone, welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for our lunchtime session with Rod Oram. We're going to be looking at what a post-COVID sustainable economy will look like, how we may get there, and the role of us as the younger working generation. We're super excited to have Rod with us today. I know he has spent a lot of his lockdown time analysing what this pandemic will mean for New Zealand and our economy. So we look forward to hearing his insights soon. But before we get into it, I'd like to just quickly introduce myself and give a bit of background to the Sustainable Business Network and the Now Crowd. So my name is Holly Leach. I'm in the projects and advisory team at SBN, and I also lead our Now Crowd project. So the Sustainable Business Network is New Zealand's largest and longest standing sustainable business organisation, and our network includes over 600 organisations across diverse industries and throughout New Zealand. The Now Crowd specifically is our network of young professionals who are in the early stages of their career and eager to drive sustainability within their organisations. The Now Crowd aims to equip young people with the confidence, capability and impact in sustainability, and we do this through a range of tools, resources, events and mentorship. We've been going for 2 years now and we've seen some epic results with young people really moving and getting sustainability moving within their organisations, which is super exciting. So if you're keen to get involved in the Now Crowd, now really is the time. So flick us an email. The Now Crowd's email is kiora@nowcrowd.org.nz. Or if you've got any questions, feel free to get in contact with me personally. My email is holly@sustainable.org.nz. But anyway, we're here to talk about a post-COVID sustainable regenerative economy. Before this crazy virus broke out, we were full of optimism and excitement. Carbon action and a transition to a low carbon circular economy were front of mind. We could see a clear path to restoring nature and looking after the people around us. Then in a blink of an eye, COVID-19 hit us. The focus then turned to staying safe, keeping in our bubbles and flattening the curve. Yet some amazing things have happened while we've been in lockdown, and I'm sure many of you have noticed. The air is now cleaner, the cities are quieter, and our beautiful birds, fish, and animals have returned. So this just shows us that when we stop thrashing Papa Tuanuku, she will show us her resiliency and strength. However, unfortunately, the same has not applied for our economy. This pandemic has shocked us, and it has made apparent how fragile and unsustainable our current economic systems are. So now is a time we need to fight to ensure we do not return to the pre-COVID business as usual. Business as usual was already failing us. It was causing climate change, polluting water, growing piles of waste and social inequity. Now we have a chance to work together to move our economy onto a path based on low carbon, circularity of resources and regeneration of our water. Although the impacts of climate change have not gone away, we now have an opportunity to reset our economy and help nurture and restore our living systems that we as humans utterly depend on. So on that, I would now like to hand it over to Megan. Megan is one of our fantastic board members and one of the key people behind the scenes that help make the Now Crowd happen. So Megan and I will be co-facilitating this event. So thank you, Megan. Thanks for being here with us today. If you'd like to introduce yourself, share some of your thoughts that you've had over the past couple of weeks, and then we'll get on to Rod's presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Holly. Kia ora, everyone. As Holly said, I'm Megan. I'm one of the newer board members for the Now crowd. I work in corporate recruitment and known as the go-to waste person for my floor at work. It's been a really full-on 6 weeks. I think we're all experiencing that, and I spend a lot of my time oscillating between optimism and fear and just seeming to go between the two every day, really. I'm optimistic when I see flamingos near Mumbai and an ability to see the Hollywood sign. But then at the same time, I'm really fearful as I hear of friends who lose their jobs and the impact that might have on their livelihoods. I'm optimistic as I see an explosion, especially online through some channels of support for local New Zealand businesses and the amazing Kiwi ingenuity that's coming through those. But at the same time, fear as we see some of our businesses cut critical sustainability initiatives and roles. I'm optimistic as we hear stories of companies innovating and changing at a pace that we haven't seen before, and consider what the opportunity might be if we align that pace of change to environmental impact as well. And then the fear as people talk about this incoming economic plummet that's greater than the Great Depression, but optimistic about the opportunity for the economy to be made new, where people and planet are really at the centre. Rod's voice has been a steadying one for me during this time. He's captured the intertwined nature of our problem, shared his knowledge of current and historically equivalent moments from 40 years of being a journalist, and provided a glimpse to the vision of the future from conversations with New Zealand CEOs during lockdown. Rod's style makes understanding the magnitude of the circumstances simple with some punchy truths, but he always leaves you with optimism and an action for a better future. Thank you for joining us today, Rod, for your time to share wisdom on the lessons of the past and opportunities to make a sustainable future. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Megan, and to Holly too, for inviting me to be involved this hour with you over this lunchtime session. Kia ora tātou to you all. It's rather bewildering as to how we might pick our way through all this, but I'll give it a go. Holly very helpfully suggested I touch on 4 things, which is, are there some learnings from the global financial crisis that can help us now? Secondly, what are the potential opportunities that exist for us, particularly here in New Zealand? Thirdly, how is business resilience and innovation playing out in this? And fourthly, what's the role of millennials? So in 15 minutes, I'm going to traverse those 4 issues, and then very much look forward to the discussion thereafter. I'm going to say 4 points about the global financial crisis. The first one is that although many people realized something wrong was unfolding with the global financial system, it was a relatively slow development compared with the speed of development of the COVID-19 epidemic. But in that process for the global financial crisis, what struck me was how unexpected and unpredictable things were. An event might happen one day and in one part of the world, and then there would be these repercussions elsewhere in the financial system in other parts of the world, and you didn't understand what the connections were. It took a while to make those connections and to see how those things fitted together. Speaking personally, it helped a great deal when I reached a kind of a Zen-like state of unshockability. I was still taking things very seriously, but I no longer went, oh my God, what the hell's going on here? I just said, okay, let's just try and work through this. That day was Monday, September the 15th. I was sitting in a hotel room in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I was in South America looking at New Zealand dairy farming investments there. And on one hand, we had Lehman Brothers going bankrupt in the early hours of that morning. And on the other hand, we had Fonterra enmeshed in its Sanyu crisis with tainted infant formula in China, which was not particularly to do with the global financial crisis, but there were many sort of corporate issues and market issues that had some resonance. And I was trying to work out something to say about all this before doing my regular Tuesday morning 9 to noon slot, because indeed it was Tuesday morning in New Zealand at that time. The second point was that about the GFC was we saw a very strong international response, and there was quite a high degree of international cooperation between central banks. Now, unfortunately, we're not seeing that with the COVID epidemic. We're seeing the World Health Organization under huge fire, very political, very unfounded, a lot of the criticisms, and that's particularly coming out of the United States. And yet, even more pressingly than the global financial crisis, we actually have to have very strong global cooperation on this, whether it's to contain the epidemic and then moving on from there, trying to find new protocols by which we can interact as countries, perhaps start some international travel going again, but above all to be able to work collaboratively to create a vaccine, or probably multiple vaccines, and be able to get those out to people. And the third one was there was a very great deal of innovation, and a lot of it in the GFC, a lot of it was quite controversial. So the whole idea of quantitative easing, how could central banks create money, in effect, to be able to keep the financial system going, was a very important part of that innovation. One of the great benefits of that was that when it was really obvious with the COVID epidemic that economic activity would contract very, very rapidly, far, far more radically and damagingly than during the global financial crisis. So in many countries, ours included, during lockdown, we're down to only about 65 or 60% of normal economic activity. And economies are perpetual money machines where the money goes round and round, but they can only function relatively smoothly when they're running at almost at 100%. In a normal recession, whereby there is a drop off in economic activity of only 2 or 3% in a normal recession, that causes problems. But now we're looking at these periods of a loss of about 35 or 40% of economic activity, which is a huge shock to the system. But some of the mechanisms that central banks and governments learned during the global financial crisis as ways to very rapidly get money into places in the economy where they're needed, that's proved to be a very good lesson that we've carried over. The fourth one, though, is about debt and damage. We got through the global financial crisis by creating a vast volume of debt. So by the end of last year, global debt was up to 250 trillion US dollars. That's private sector debt, corporate debt, government debt. And that was an increase of 1/3 in only the decade following on from the global financial crisis. And very interestingly, it was the corporate sector which had led that. So corporate debt globally has increased by 50% in that decade since the GFC, which has actually made companies rather less able to deal with the shocks now and needing more help from governments. The damage side, though, flowed through to societies as well, because one of the policy responses in a number of countries was government budget austerity in order to offset those increases in government debt, which then had very big impacts in terms of health, education, society, mobility of households, economic mobility to be able to go to other places for other jobs or to move on to progress their own careers. And we need to be thus incredibly focused now on making sure that what we do is not having those unintended consequences, or even consequences that were understood at the time but were accepted as the necessary price of being able to save the global financial system. So anyway, that's the first subject and some of the parallels between now and then. Then it was a financial crisis which fled through to an economic crisis, which then flowed through to societal impacts, some of them negative, a few in restructuring, rather more positive. But this time we've started with a health crisis which has moved very, very fast, far faster than an economic crisis, with enormous economic impact and thus big social impact as well. The second subject then is about business resilience, and I found this very exciting to see how our companies and organisations have been responding here in New Zealand. I've been doing a series of CEO interviews on Newsroom, easily found. If you look up my name, you'll on the Newsroom website, you'll easily find those pieces. I think I'm now up to about 15 or 16 of them. And a very common theme that's come through is how quickly these organizations understood how big the impact was going to be, or at least have some measure of it, and responded very drastically and at high speed. Some of the things that have come through have been not just that speed and confidence in acting, but also a very high degree of innovation and being prepared to make decisions based on the available information, knowing that you don't know enough, but it's far more important to act now and then to adjust as you learn more and as you see how that initial response worked through. So it's very good to see that kind of process. But above all, the thing I'm enjoying most about business resilience is how it's actually bringing people together in organizations. So we've got this quite unexpected consequence, positively, of we've got this physical distancing of in workplaces, either with people working remotely, or if they still need to be in the same physical premises, separating themselves to have the physical distance and kind of disaggregating processes so people can work in very small teams or individually. And what's happened, I'm finding in organization after organization, is that because of that physical distancing, people have worked far more attentively on social cohesion. And people, when they check in with each other, whether it's online like this or whether it's kind of at a distance in their disaggregated workspaces, they're taking a genuine interest in each other. And that sense of working together on a cause, whether it's keeping the company afloat, whether it's making that company's contribution to our national response to the crisis, these are, I think, very, very positive. And I'm hearing time and again about how that's changing cultures for the better inside organizations. And I very much hope that as our work lives become different, but the way we work and the speed we work slows down a little bit and we get back to a more sustainable, a more normal kind of way of working, we'll be able to carry through and benefit from some of these very big shifts. The next thing is about, the third point I want to make is about what the opportunities for us in New Zealand. I can only start at the very, very biggest expression of this, which is to make sure that everything we do works with nature, not against it. In other words, we have to take very, very seriously what on earth's happening to the planet, what on earth's happening to Earth systems, and how on earth we turn around the very substantial damage we do to ecosystems, to living systems, to those Earth systems. We know from all the evidence that we are living well beyond those planetary boundaries, well mapped out by, in particular, the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And we know that we've got to change everything we do so we come back within those boundaries while still meeting the needs of 7.8 billion people now, and as we look out towards 2050, possibly 10 billion people on the planet. That means we've actually got to change pretty much everything. The way our politics works, the way our economics works, the way financial systems work, the technologies we use, and making sure that the values and the principles that carry us through that are very strong and very true. Now, moving from that sort of overarching view of the challenge, it gets to be very difficult to give expression to that across a sector or across a segment of economy or of society. But there are some frameworks that do help. And so those of you who are familiar with my work know that I've long been a fan of Kate Raworth, for example, and her donut economy work. And it's been very exciting to see how Kate's been developing that over recent years, and particularly now in these times. So I would offer you that work, where she emphasizes in her two circles. The inner circle is the social floor, but that creates the social cohesion, the social strength, which empowers people, gives people the skills, the support, the resources they need to be very active in this enormous task of reinventing everything we're doing. And then, of course, the outer circle are the planetary limits that we have to work between, work within. And so between those two circles is the safe and just place for humankind. There are other very important frameworks. I think the whole idea behind impact investment and social enterprises and the like, which are bringing very powerful new dimensions to the way business works, is also another good example of this. But overall, I believe our great opportunity in Aotearoa is to show how, admittedly, a small population, given our land size, 5 million people, we'll hit that big number in a few months' time here in New Zealand. And we are actually a surprisingly large country physically. We don't often think of ourselves that way. We are very low density population. But we've got some unique ecosystems here, unique species, indigenous species, and already in our existing systems, our natural environment is hugely important to us in terms of how we define ourselves, how we earn a living. And of course, that natural environment is not just about the farming sector or about forestry or fisheries. Those are surprisingly small parts of the economy in GDP terms, important, but they're not the whole story of the economy. But how important those ecosystems and earth systems are in terms of other aspects of our economic activity. Of course, it has been tourism. We now have to reinvent that from an international tourist point of view. But of course, it's fundamentally important to us as New Zealanders in terms of how we feel about this remarkable land and spirit of this place. So I know that doesn't in any way start to identify a to-do list as to where our opportunities lie, but I hope it gives you a sort of a very strong sense of an opportunity that we can give a particular expression to these issues that will be beneficial to us and helpful to people elsewhere in the world. And then lastly is, where do millennials fit in? Well, very simply, you all are the people who bring clarity, who bring cut through, who bring encouragement on all these issues. And that is now far more important than ever. So much of what I've been reading, what I've been hearing about how we respond to the COVID crisis and then recovery and then rebuild after that is very vague. It's very predictable. It's very much about tweaking existing systems. But as I can't emphasize enough, we have to build some very, very different systems, inspired and energized and encouraged by the sorts of values that I've touched on so far. So you are hugely important in this. But rest assured, you are not alone in this. In a sense, being a millennial is not just a matter of how old you are. It's not a count of the years you've lived so far. It is actually about a view of the world. And rest assured, there are lots of people of all kinds of ages who share with you that urgent sense of bringing clarity, cut through and engagement on all this. So I want to assure you that you've got lots of people who can give you all the support and all the encouragement you want in this, and will be shoulder to shoulder with you as we go about these tasks. So I'm going to stop at that point because I'm very keen to hear what's on your minds and to hear what sort of discussion we have amongst ourselves for the rest of our time together. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rod. It's been really interesting, I think, to explore sort of the complexity and interconnectedness of the economic, social, political, and kind of environmental failures that we've created and really found ourselves in now. With the frameworks that you've mentioned, and I guess more in mind, what businesses or industries and governments have you seen leading the way with regards to transitioning to a regenerative economic model?
I'd have to say, sadly, at this stage, the people who understand the nature of a true circularity of natural systems, and therefore how our economic activity has to be circular too, and how do we make sure that we make this enormous shift from being exploitive in our economic systems to regenerative. In other words, we're taking our foot off the neck of nature. We're trying to give nature a chance to heal and recover itself so it can be more resilient in those ecosystems and therefore better support us. Those are ideas that are still very niche, they're very leading edge, they're very early stage. And so I think one of the biggest tasks of all is our ability to be able to articulate those principles and to give good examples of them. So there are examples. One I will relate back to Kate Raworth's work. She had long been working with the city of Amsterdam on how it might address all its great challenges. This was well before COVID crisis blew up. But the plan that got released during lockdown in Amsterdam about a month ago is a very good expression at a city level about how these things to come together. So I'd offer that as an example. In terms of many companies, obviously for companies, it's very hard to make an abrupt shift. It is about a journey towards those goals by initially reducing one's adverse impact on economy of your activity, on the ecosystems, on society, even negative impacts on the economy itself. And understanding as you reduce those, you're also at the same time working towards some understanding about how you can start to build your model around those circular principles. And of course, the work that SBN is already doing on circular economy is very helpful in that. And there are plenty of examples within the SBN network of companies on that journey.
Cool, great, thank you. And just a reminder to everyone that's tuning in to submit your questions. There's just a little Q&A function down the bottom. So yeah, if anything pops up, chuck it in there. I've actually got a question from Rachel Brown. She's sent me a text. So banks are being criticised in their response to business under COVID. Government has become the support loan for business. What should banks be doing to create a strong economy here?
The banks have made some progress, albeit they are resting very heavily on government support. So the vast volume of financial help that's flowing through to companies, it's money that's being largely created by the central bank and by government. In the government, central bank is doing quantitative easing, the government's borrowing more, and that's underpinning loan programs and the like in the banking sector. The banking sector, I feel, is working better here than in some other countries, but they clearly are still quite bound up in their existing systems, and I'm being a bit cautious here. I don't want them to suddenly go wild in their systems. They need good systems. But I'd like to see far more innovation in those systems so that they can extend more help and faster and more creative ways to companies. So that would be my main encouragement for them. And they've certainly got all the help they need in terms of raw financial resource from the central bank and from the Reserve Bank and from government. I'd like to see them put that to work far faster, but also sharing in the burden here. And I think this is a fundamentally important principle across all of these issues, that pretty much everything in the economy is a chain of some kind. So I'll give you an example. You might have a small hospitality business or retail business, say in a shopping mall. It can't pay rent to the owner of that shopping mall and needs to have a negotiation about some forgiveness, not just putting off the rent, because that only postpones the problem till later, but some forgiveness for that. But that means that the property company then has to go back to its shareholders and to its banks to say, well, we've got this reduced value in our portfolio and we've got this reduced rent flow coming through. We need some help from you. So banks have been, for a very long time, very profitable, and their shareholders have done very well out of that. So this is now a time for those banks to help shoulder the burden, share that burden, as we all need to do across the whole economy.
With regards to the response from the government, one person sort of commented that it seems quite rooted in the past and failing to take the chance to reorientate. What are your sort of comments and thoughts on that, and what are the opportunities for us to pivot in that space?
This is tricky because governments in a democracy only move just about somewhat slower than the kind of the middle of public opinion at any one time. Yet in this case, they had to move astonishingly quickly to shut down the economy and put in all kinds of health mechanisms and protocols to deal with the crisis. And it was very exciting to see them move so quickly, but it was in pretty draconian and undemocratic ways. And understandably, many of us sort of said, okay, we understand why you need to move this fast and without that much consultation and without appropriate democratic safeguards and all the rest. So that was the right thing to do. And the government did respond well through that. However, what's going on now is the government is still trying to deal with the immediacy of the issues, and it's only looking a relatively short way ahead as to how we come down through the alert levels and try to get back to a normal time. It's vaguely talking about the future, but in not really in sort of breakthrough thinking at all. One of the key tests is going to be for the tourism sector, for example. In the absence of international tourists, how on earth does the tourism sector increase its revenues from the domestic New Zealand tourists who now are no longer going abroad? But how do we do that in a way that not just perpetuates some existing models about tourism in terms of how it's structured, how businesses are financed, how they earn their revenue, but how do we very significantly change the whole tourism experience so it becomes deeper, less superficial. It's not a kind of a drive-by through some beautiful bit of scenery or whatever, but gets us engaged locally with people, with ecosystems, perhaps, for example, playing our part in some restoration project. So we can have once we experiment on ourselves domestically about that different kind of tourism, I think as we begin to open up to international tourists, we'd be offering something very, very different to them than we were offering in the past. But again, I'm really worried that government is just going to find this all far too hard, far too complicated, far too interlinked, interdependent, and will kind of slump back exhausted to tried and true old methods. But I think that's a risk across the whole of society. That we talk rather excitedly now about this great future that we want, and this is the great opportunity for us to build it. But when we get stuck into the reality of that, we just find it all too hard, and we find the imperfect past looks a little better than we thought it did as we sink back into it. So we've got to stay focused, stay bold and ambitious, and find ways to work with people in very productive and encouraging ways to try and get some real momentum going here.
Cool, thanks. And I totally resonate with what you're saying there. I'm really fearful that we are just going to slip back into that status quo, and that's fine. And it's something I've found myself thinking about a lot, and I know a lot of other people have been as well. So how do we actually avoid that and ensure that our values are shifted to like an alignment with nature? And sort of, I know you've touched on it, but yeah, more on that. How do we do that, and how can business do that?
I'm going to say something incredibly simplistic and obvious, but I don't know of any other starting point really, which is we have to live by those values that we want and we know are right, and bring that authenticity, that conviction, that sense of purpose, but also that example to others. And we then need to find ways to come together. And so organizations like SBN and the Now Crowd are perfect places for people to come together to share those great passions, share the experience they've got, seek help, seek encouragement, seek support. I don't know really if, I'm sorry that's so simplistic, but that seems to me that's the only way this can happen. We have to be able to articulate and demonstrate what we know we want, what we know is right, and what we know that will be better off for being able to deploy at scale. But above all, to be creative, excited, encouraged by this. And I sit here saying all that and having to, I'd be the first to acknowledge, I've sat here in this room with a lovely sunny outlook, just staring at my screen these last weeks going, I'm overwhelmed. I just don't know how we get out of this. I recognize that in myself, and it would be true for all of us. And so I think being honest about that and being able to talk about that is part of it. And I go back to what I've been picking up about cultures of companies. It is that caring, that when they're checking in, it's not a superficial, oh, how are you? Oh, you're fine, okay, I'm moving on to the next thing on the agenda. It's about really listening. It's about really being empathetic and identifying with people, but in a way that, and this is incredibly hard to pull off, doesn't paralyze you. It's hard to, and I express how difficult this for me, as it is for all of us, to be able to engage in a true and honest and helpful way, and yet still and not be burdened by that, not be dragged down by that. Just trying to find the positive in that to spur us on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing I found most useful is the nature of going online in recent weeks. It has enabled us to get access to content that we might not have had before. So events like this, and I saw that Kate Raworth was speaking with Aotearoa Town Hall recently as well. And so that's incredible. And I think it's using those injections of enthusiasm and inspiration to keep our momentum going too. There's a question in terms of the Zero Carbon Act. So there was obviously some great progress being made in that space pre-COVID, and it seems like it's kind of terrible timing, as with many things at the moment. The question is specifically around, in terms of having the direction from legislation to drive green finance and green thinking in our companies as we come out of COVID, and not just scrambling to regenerate the economy. What are your thoughts in terms of the legislation and driving forward of green finance at this time?
I think any government, not just a reasonably functioning democracy like ours, can't be the outright leader. It obviously reflects society and what society wants. And therefore, we have to create the momentum as individuals and as organizations. We have to create the momentum, create the understanding, and then government can act. And so specifically on the Zero Carbon Bill, it was immensely helpful that there was the Climate Leaders Coalition, which was very staunch and very articulate on these issues. At some point, I hope somebody writes the definitive history of how the Zero Carbon Bill got through and who was talking to who and what sort of lobbying was going on, because we did sort of get there. But again, that will be a dead letter of a law on the books if the people on the ground aren't actually pushing for it to be operationalized and demonstrating how it works. And so that applies across the piece in terms of not just the Zero Carbon Act, but across all the changes we need to make. Governments can enable that, but don't expect them to lead it. The leadership has actually got to come absolutely from us.
Absolutely. And sort of leading on from that, you said that you'd done a number of CEO interviews, 15 to 16, which is super impressive, and that you're amazed by how quickly they are moving and responding to this pandemic. So can you give us examples of what some of these big businesses are doing to move away from the business as usual pre-COVID?
Yeah, well, the most astonishing example was actually the first interview I did was with Grant Webster of Tourism Holdings, because he was perfectly matter of fact. We're actually staring at essentially zero revenues. The business model just has ceased to exist. You know, we manufacture camper vans and we rent them out, but there's no tourists coming. We'll be able to repurpose a few of them up at Whangaparoa as quarantine places for people coming back from Wuhan. But we might be able to repurpose some for seasonal fruit pickers, as they did. And so they're going through a huge shift in terms of understanding that they have some very, very good skills in the tourism sector about understanding what people want and need when they travel, and therefore being able to supply them with that, not just physically the camper van, but other things around that. And so that's the big shift they're moving away from that almost entire focus on camper vans. I mean, they had some other things like Kiwi Experience, bus tours and the rest, but to a broader portfolio. But very crucially, they are very well on through their sustainability framework, and they use the Future Fit one. And they are absolutely staunch that what they're doing is absolutely within that Future Fit framework. So that would be one of the more sort of eye-watering examples. But then, for example, I'll give you another example. Two of them, in fact, because the contrast internationally is quite powerful. Our meat processing plants worked out pretty quickly how to disaggregate the workflow to make it safer in anti-COVID terms for people to work. It reduced their productivity by about 25 or 30%. And that had then caused problems for farmers who were trying to, being late summer, early autumn, were wanting to reduce their stock numbers before going into winter. And so there's been a bit of a pile up of animals still on farm, but they're working through that. But they kept working. And as far as I know, there are no examples of anybody working on those in those abattoirs contracting COVID-19. In contrast, in the United States, astonishingly, the capacity of pork production in the United States has fallen by 50% because COVID is rampant in many meat plants. And yet you have a president there that is kind of ordering the people to keep doing what they're doing, albeit supposed to be within the health protocols that have been outlined, but clearly it's not working. You've got, a pork plant which is responsible for 5% of US pork processing has been closed. Chicken plants are going the same way. So that, to me, is a very dramatic example about how we have done that right in New Zealand in comparison with overseas. The other another big pivot that's going on, and you're seeing quite widely, is that whereas e-commerce had been perhaps part of a company's business, they now understand that it needs to be a very large part of it. And so we're seeing many companies that are making a very rapid transition to e-commerce and contactless commerce of various kinds. And to me, that's another big theme throughout all of this.
I have definitely seen that as well. I think I was watching the news yesterday, and couriers are at levels greater than Christmas periods, which is, it's kind of that balance. And I think you referenced it in one of your articles of one of the key things we need to do is to drive supply and demand outside of the essential services. But at the same time, I guess the paradigm of that is we're driving supply and demand within the system that hasn't served us well. And so I guess, what are your sort of comments in terms of how do we balance that and make sure that we enable ourselves to drive that shift and that transformation that we need, but to also meet those sort of short-term needs from a livelihood perspective?
Yeah, I must admit, I am really feel very uncomfortable. Actually, it doesn't even begin to capture it. I feel desperately disheartened that understandably companies who are serving consumers are desperate to try to get any kind of revenue going again. And so they're frantically chasing after the opportunities they can get. And I admire the pivot to e-commerce, but we aren't asking ourselves a far more fundamental question: is actually, do we need that item or that takeaway meal or whatever? I'm not, and the big change that has to come is actually in consumption patterns, not in delivery mechanisms. And of course, that's a discussion you don't hear much of at all. So I think that a very important thing for us to do in all this is say, well, actually, this would actually be a really good time to think about consuming less and make sure that the economy we rebuild, or the new economy we build, is far, far less consumption driven. than the one that is deeply, deeply dislocated and desolated by the epidemic.
Yeah, totally. I agree. We need to look at that consumption, but I also think it's great that this awareness of supporting local businesses that we've seen, especially in the past couple of weeks. But anyway, I'm cautious of time. I would just like to ask a question that's more focused towards the Now crowd, people that are watching out there. So a lot of Now crowders don't work specifically in sustainability. They're just sustainability champions and really want to get things moving faster within their organization. What sort of tips do you have for those guys? What can they do tomorrow to raise that question in a sensitive way when that business is obviously going through a hard time as well?
There are two core relationships or mechanisms that I've seen for decades now around sustainability. The first one is that when an organization switches onto it and gets excited about it, it brings about a change internally with staff, not dissimilar to the one we're now seeing in the epidemic, of greater cohesion. And one of the things that's always delighted me hugely about all this is that when organizations latch onto this, and it's articulated from the top and everybody's in, lots of people get involved. All sorts of people who were pretty quiet, didn't really say much, might suddenly perk up with all kinds of ideas. They find a real cause that they relate to here. So that's the first point I'd make, that this is exciting, it is encouraging, it does bring people together. The second one is that in a crude sense, what we're after is a very great, much higher degree of efficiency. It's not efficiency in the sense of doing the same thing with less resource. It's about making sure that in that circularity of systems, we have the ultimate efficiency, that nothing is wasted, and that we have ample, totally renewable resource to meet the needs of potentially 10 billion people. And that is such an extraordinarily fundamental business driver, or a driver of any kind of a family, or an NGO, or a social club, or whatever. We tend to be disparaging about that sense of efficiency. It's about cutting costs. It's trying to do more with less. But think of efficiency as being that beautiful perpetual machine, which is ecosystems, which keep, as we regenerate them, as we let them regenerate themselves, and they become ever more resilient in themselves and can offer us more. That's the natural efficiency, if you like, that we're after. And I think trying to give examples, give expression, give encouragement around those two particular points about involving people in it and people being excited about that, but in an understanding what that that ultimate efficiency is, where we're doing everything with nature, not against it, works in any kind of organization, even one that seems to have a minimal call on or impact on or consumption of natural systems. If you unpick a business, you will find the nature in it. So nurture that nature.
Awesome. I'll just jump into one final question from the Q&A from everyone before we do a rapid fire final five. Someone's asked, have you seen The Planet of the Humans by Mike Moore? And if so, what are your thoughts on the likelihood of renewable energy able to meet the needs of people in New Zealand?
I haven't seen it. I have long been a Mike Moore fan, but I'm very distressed by this because there's clearly, from what I've been reading about it, a lot of incredibly outdated interviews, data, and all the rest. And I'm actually not going to watch it because the trusted reviewers that I've read means that there is nothing in there that I can learn from. But the whole question of, can we get to renewable energy, completely renewable resources, we've got to, because that's the only way that humans can continue to survive on this planet, let alone 10 billion of us. So it's not a question of can we do it, is we've got to do it. If we don't, there is, we will be extinct. It's as simple as that. We humans are fleetingly a life form on this planet. The planet is 4.5 billion years old. Humans in the form we more or less look like today have only been around for 200,000 years. The industrial age has only been around for 200 years out of 4,500 million years. The planet has gone through enormous changes in life forms and systems before. It will go through huge changes because of us, and we can either be part of that journey or be extinct. It's as simple as that.
Thank you. I feel as though we could continue talking for hours, but I thought we'd finish with a fast 5. So a quick 5 questions and just the first thought or answer that comes to you. So they should be pretty straightforward. I think you'll be all good. What is your favorite article or book during isolation?
Oh, crikey, that's so hard. I'm completely stumped because I've been reading so much. Let me background process that while you ask me another.
Okay, sure. There's lots of sources of news out there. And what is your go-to for staying up to date with global trends?
I scan very widely. So on economics, there is a wonderful site called Evonomics, which is about new economics. But the New Economics Foundation in the UK is another example of that. In terms of international media, it's going to sound desperately predictable, but it's the Financial Times, which is the best business publication in the world. It's very non-ideological, it's very practical, it's very grounded. I also, for an alternative view, will sometimes look at the Wall Street Journal or spend some time every day seeing how some of these things aren't working out, or that's a little unfair to the Wall Street Journal. Guardian, Washington Post, New York Times, Al Jazeera. Here in New Zealand, I'm obviously a fan of Newsroom, and Radio New Zealand are the two best sources. Mainstream media is really struggling here in New Zealand. The wonderful thing is, though, that there is an amazing diversity of sources out there. So I think it's really important for us all to find a range of sources that challenge us. They don't just play to our particular preoccupations. And then, share those lists, share those ideas, because there is an amazing amount out there. So go looking for the ones that mean the most to you.
Awesome. What 3 characteristics do you need to be a sustainability champion in 2020?
3 great characteristics. Huge clarity. It's not a question about being able to deliver a headline. It's about being able to deliver an insight where people go, okay, I get that. So very few of us ever manage to once in a while come up with those insights. So we normally retell others, which is really fine. So do share those insights with other people, but make sure you can be very on point and really deliver a message that's succinct and that's encouraging. So again, I go back to the 3 points I made earlier about clarity, cut through, and encouragement. Those for me would be the 3 big characteristics.
Awesome. In a sentence, what would you recommend to a young professional who is experiencing COVID-19 as their first major economic crisis?
I would say you are fantastically lucky to have this major crisis so early in your career, where people have no idea how to respond. So you can jump in because your ideas are probably better than those who have been jaded and discouraged and otherwise beaten up by previous decades. And I'm sorry, I'm going to add a sobering note here. We ain't seen nothing yet. And this is nothing compared with the kind of pandemic. Coronavirus spreads pretty rapidly, but it doesn't kill. I mean, I take very seriously about the number of people it kills, but there are far worse illnesses and diseases out there that kill 40 or 50% of the people who contract it. So we ain't seen nothing yet. So learn really fast now, not just about epidemics, but about how to respond to them, how to keep up your sense of purpose and perspective through all this, because the challenges and thus the opportunities are actually only going to get greater in the years ahead.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the Fast 5 answers and also just for your time today. It's been super insightful and so amazing to get the years of wisdom and insight that you have and think about how we can apply that to our workplaces and our communities and be really true agitators for change within the New Zealand environment. Absolutely a plug for News Hub. Jump on there and have a look at...
No, Newsroom.
Newsroom.
Competition.
Sorry.
Right.
Newsroom.
And we're showing how a reader revenue driven model can work. But I just want to wish you all, the very best and just keep up through all this and just wish that you, hope that you keep up with ups and downs along the way, a sense of fun, adventure, and I don't mean those frivolously, those are all terribly important to keep us all going and just be together virtually and otherwise so we can take heart from each other.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rod. Yeah, I just want to echo what Megan has said about sharing your wisdom today. We really appreciate it. It was great to finally have you at a Now Crowd event. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us as well. We hope you enjoyed the past hour, learned a thing or two from Rod and got some of your questions answered. If you've got any further questions that you'd like Rod to answer, or questions about the Sustainable Business Network or the Now Crowd, please do get in touch with myself, holly@sustainable.org.nz. Keep safe, keep well, everyone. Hopefully we can all be together properly soon. But yeah, ka kite, have a good day, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.